On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump announced his intention to restore and expand what he calls Schedule F. Most Americans have no idea what that means. But here's Schedule F is a classification that would let the president fire tens of thousands of career federal employees and replace them with political loyalists. We're not talking about appointed positions at the top of agencies. We're talking about scientists at the EPA, lawyers at the Justice Department, analysts at intelligence agencies, career professionals who've been there through multiple administrations, serving Republicans and Democrats alike. When I was in the White House, I worked with career staff who'd been there since Reagan, some since Carter. They weren't there because of their politics. They were there because they knew how the government actually functions. And that knowledge, that institutional memory, that expertise, it's what keeps the machinery running when administrations change. Trump tried this before. Right at the end of his first term, in October 2020, he issued an executive order creating Schedule F. The order would have reclassified up to 50,000 federal employees in policy. Now Trump's bringing it back, and he's not being subtle about why. Here's what this would mean in practice. Right now, career federal employees have job protections. You can't fire them without cause, without due process. That's not some bureaucratic luxury. That's there for a reason. It means when a scientist at the CDC says something the president doesn't like about a pandemic, they can't be fired for telling the truth. When a lawyer at the Justice Department refuses to pursue a politically motivated prosecution, they can't lose their job for following. Schedule F removes those protections. It makes employment contingent on loyalty to the president, not competence, not integrity, not the law. And once you create that system, every future president inherits it. That's the precedent we're talking. This isn't theory. We've seen what happens when governments purge their bureaucracies based on political loyalty. It's not a story that ends well. Turkey under Erdogan dismissed over 100,000 civil servants after a failed coup attempt. Hungary under Orban systematically replaced career officials with loyalists throughout government agencies. Viktor Yanukovych did it in each case. The justification was efficiency, rooting out corruption, making government work for the people. In each case, what actually happened was the creation of a system where the only qualification that mattered. Here's why that matters for you. When the people running government agencies serve the president instead of the Constitution, those agencies stop functioning as checks on power. They become extensions of it. The EPA doesn't regulate polluters. It does what the White House tells it to. The Justice Department doesn't prosecute crimes impartially. It goes after the president's enemies and protects his allies. Intelligence agencies don't provide objective analysis. They tell the president what he wants to hear. This happened in Iraq in 2003. Intelligence professionals who questioned the evidence for weapons of mass destruction were sidelined. The ones who said what the administration wanted to hear got promoted. And we ended up in a war based when expertise becomes a liability and loyalty becomes the currency. Institutions collapse, not all at once, but steadily, predictably, and often irreversibly. Let me give you a concrete example of what Schedule F would do. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has about 20,000 employees. Most of them are career professionals who've spent decades learning how to coordinate disaster response. They know which state and local officials to call, which contractors are reliable, how to move resources quickly when a hurricane hits or wildfires break out. Under Schedule F, the president could fire those professionals and replace them with political appointees. Now imagine there's a hurricane heading toward Florida in an election year. The president wants to show he's handled. They'd say that's not how disaster relief works, that you help people based on need, not politics. But under Schedule F, those officials are gone. They've been replaced with people who understand that keeping their job means doing what the president wants. Or take the Department of Justice. Right now, the DOJ has career prosecutors who've been there through multiple administrations. When the president wants to investigate a political rival or drop charges, they can't be fired for that. Under Schedule F, they can. So you replace them with prosecutors who understand their job is to serve the president's interests, not enforce the law impartially. This isn't speculation. Trump has been explicit about what he wants to do. He's talked about using the Justice Department to prosecute political enemies. He's talked about firing generals who won't follow his. He's talked about purging the intelligence community of people he considers disloyal. Schedule F is the mechanism that makes all of that possible. Now let's talk about what happens when those protections are gone, when agencies lose the people who actually know how to do the work. The Environmental Protection Agency has scientists who've spent decades studying air quality, water contamination, chemical safety. They're the ones who know which pollutants cause cancer, which companies are violating regulations, how to design. Under Schedule F, the president could fire them and replace them with industry lobbyists or political operatives who've never done environmental science in their lives. The result isn't just bad policy, it's dangerous. People get sick, communities get poisoned, and by the time anyone figures out what went wrong, the damage is done. The Centers for Disease Control has epidemiologists who track disease outbreaks, who understand how viruses spread, who know which interventions work. And during COVID-19, we saw what happens when we saw misinformation spread because the message was coming from people who didn't understand the science. Now imagine the dynamic, but permanent. Imagine the CDC run entirely by political appointees whose main qualification is loyalty to the president. The next pandemic hits, and instead of getting honest assessments about them, that's propaganda with a body count. The intelligence community has analysts who spent careers studying specific regions, specific threats. They speak the languages. They understand the cultures. They know which sources are reliable. When the president asks about a potential military operation or a foreign policy decision, those analysts provide objective assessments of the risks and opportunities. But under Schedule F, those analysts can be fired and replaced with people who tell the president what he wants to hear. And that's when you get intelligence failures. That's when you end up in wars you shouldn't be in, or this is the pattern when governments prioritize loyalty over expertise. Institutions don't just become less effective, they become actively harmful. Look at what happened in Hungary. Viktor Orbán took power in 2010 and systematically replaced career civil servants with party loyalists. Environmental regulators stopped enforcing pollution laws against companies owned by Orbán's allies. Tax authorities started auditing opposition, politicians, and independent media while ignoring corruption by government insiders. Universities lost accreditation if they taught things the government didn't like. The result was a country where the machinery of government became an instrument of political control rather than public service. Hungary is still technically a democracy. They have elections, they have a parliament, but when every institution answers to one man, Turkey followed a similar path. After the 2016 coup attempt, Erdogan dismissed over 100,000 civil servants, teachers, judges, and military officers. The justification was rooting out conspirators. Ukraine, under Yanukovych, went through the same process. Career prosecutors were replaced with loyalists who went after Yanukovych's political enemies while protecting his allies. Regulatory agencies stopped enforcing laws. And you know what happened when ordinary Ukrainians finally said enough is enough? When they took to the streets in 2014, the government collapsed because it had no legitimacy. The institutions that were supposed to serve the public had become tools of one man's power. That's the danger with Schedule F. You're not just changing who works in government. You're changing what government is for. You're transforming it from an instrument of public service into an instrument of presidential power. And here's the thing about precedents. Once you establish them, they're almost impossible to reverse. If Trump implements Schedule F and the next president inherits its system, they're inheriting a government where 50,000 employees, but the power is there, waiting to be used. Think about what that means for different parts of government. The Department of Justice investigates and prosecutes federal crimes. Right now, career prosecutors make decisions based on evidence and law. They don't ask what the president wants. Under Schedule F, those prosecutors serve at the pleasure of the president. So when someone politically connected commits a crime, or when the president wants to investigate a political opponent, those prosecutors know their jobs depend on giving the president what he wants. The Federal Election Commission oversees campaign finance laws and investigates violations. Career effect staff are supposed to be nonpartisan. They enforce the rules equally regardless of party. Under Schedule F, those staff members can be fired if they... So, the agency that's supposed to prevent corruption in our election becomes a tool for protecting it. The Internal Revenue Service has agents who audit tax returns and investigate tax fraud. There are strict rules about who gets audited and why. Those rules exist because we learned what happens when presidents use the IRS against their enemies. Nixon. Under Schedule F, those protections disappear. The IRS becomes a weapon. This isn't theoretical. We have Trump's own words about what he wants to do. He's talked about investigating journalists who write critical stories. He's talked about prosecuting election officials who didn't help him in 2020. He's talked about Schedule F is the mechanism that makes all of that possible. And here's what really should keep you up at night. This doesn't end with Trump. Once Schedule F is in place, every future president inherits that power. Maybe the next president is someone you trust. Maybe they use that authority responsibly. Maybe they don't abuse it. But what about 20 years from now when someone comes along who makes Trump look restrained? The power doesn't go away. It just sits there waiting to be used. And history teaches us a very clear lesson. Powers like this always get used, and they always get expanded. Think about the Patriot Act. After 9/11, we passed broad surveillance authorities to fight terrorism. The argument was we need these tools. We'll use them carefully. We'll have oversight. And maybe the people in charge at the time meant that. They got used for drug enforcement, for immigration cases, for things that had nothing to do with the original justification. That's how power works. You create it for one purpose, and it finds new purposes. Schedule F would do the same thing. It starts with, we need to make government more efficient. We need to remove obstructionists. But 5 years later, 10 years later, it becomes, we need to And at that point, you don't have a civil service anymore. You have a patronage system. Your grandchildren will grow up in a country where getting a federal job isn't about competence or qualifications. It's about political connections and loyalty tests where government agencies don't serve the public interest. They serve whoever controls the White House, where the entire concept of neutral professional administration has been replaced by partisan control. Is that the country you want to leave them? Now, I can already hear some people saying this is alarmist, that I'm exaggerating the threat, that checks and balances will hold, and I understand that instinct. Nobody wants to believe their democracy is fragile. And it doesn't happen with tanks in the streets. It happens quietly through administrative changes and personnel decisions and the slow accumulation of unchecked power. Viktor Orbán in Hungary didn't suspend elections. He just made sure every institution answered to him. Erdogan in Turkey didn't dissolve parliament. He just purged anyone who might resist him. Chavez in Venezuela didn't declare dictatorship. He just systematically took control of every lever of government until there was no one left who could tell him no. That's the playbook, and Schedule F is right out of it. So what can you do? Because I know that's what people are thinking. This all sounds terrible, but what am I supposed to do about it? First, understand what's being proposed. Most Americans have never heard of Schedule F. It sounds boring, technical, like inside baseball Washington stuff. That's exactly why it's dangerous. This isn't happening in a big dramatic moment that captures everyone's attention. It's happening quietly through executive orders and administrative procedures. You need to know what's coming. Second, contact your representatives in Congress, Republicans and Democrats. It doesn't matter. Tell them you don't want a civil service that serves the president instead of the Constitution. Tell them you value competence over loyalty. Tell them this crosses a line. Members of Congress respond to pressure from their constituents. Give them that pressure. Third, pay attention to how agencies start functioning after Schedule F is implemented. If career professionals start getting fired in large numbers, if expertise starts disappearing from government, if agencies start making decisions that and fourth, remember that this is bigger than one president or one administration. This is about what kind of government we have for the next 50 years. This is about whether the United States remains a country where institutions check power or becomes a country where power controls. Because here's the fundamental question, and it's the same question every democracy faces eventually. Either the law is above the president, or the president is above the law. Both cannot be true at the same time. The founders chose the first option. They created a system where even the most powerful person in the country has to operate within rules, has to respect institutions, has to accept that some things are beyond presidential authority. Schedule F chooses. It says the president gets to control who works in government, who implements policy, who has the power to say no. If that becomes the norm, if that becomes how our government operates, then the presidency becomes something the founders wouldn't recognize. It becomes an office without meaningful constraints, without institutional checks, without the kind of independent. I have served this country for most of my adult life. I have seen its flaws, its failures, its capacity for self-inflicted harm, but I've also seen its resilience, its ability to correct course, its commitment to the idea that that idea is being tested right now. Schedule F is the test. So let me ask you directly, do you think it's acceptable for a president to fire thousands of career civil servants and replace them with political loyalists? Yes or no? Because if the answer is yes, and if the answer is no, then you need to make that clear to the people who represent you before this becomes the new normal. Democracies don't collapse in a single moment. They erode gradually through small changes that seem manageable at the time but add up to something much bigger. Schedule F is one of those changes. And the time to push back is now, before it becomes permanent, before it becomes just how things work, before your grandchildren grow up in a country where government answers only to power instead of to the people.